In the crisp autumn of 1965, in the quiet town of Maple Creek, Ohio, a 6-year-old boy named Danny Peterson, a kid obsessed with space and stars, walked out into his backyard to play with his favorite toy robot, and was never seen again. For nearly 60 years, his disappearance haunted his family, a case with no witnesses, no ransom, and no real leads. The official theory was a simple, heartbreaking tragedy, that Danny had wandered into the dense woods bordering his home and was lost to the elements. His family was left with nothing but questions and a grief that time could never heal. The case was closed, a sad story frozen in time. That is, until 2023. While preparing their grandparents' old house for sale, Danny's own niece and nephew found something lodged deep inside the brick chimney. It was dusty, covered in soot, but unmistakable. Danny's cherished toy robot, the Comet Crusader. But it wasn't the discovery of the lost toy that would finally break 6 decades of silence. It was the tiny, tightly folded note they found hidden inside its battery compartment. A desperate 6-word message from Danny himself that would not only prove the police theory was wrong, but would finally expose the monster who had been hiding in plain sight all along. The story of what happened to Danny Peterson doesn't begin with a monster or a mystery. It begins with the simple golden light of a perfect autumn afternoon. The date was October 23, 1965, in Maple Creek, Ohio, a town stitched together with white picket fences and the shared belief that nothing truly bad could ever happen there. It was a town of unlocked doors, of kids playing outside until the streetlights came on. A place where the American dream felt less like an ambition and more like the air you breathed. And on that Saturday, 6-year-old Danny Peterson was breathing it in. To anyone watching, he was just a small boy in a red sweater, kneeling in a pile of fallen leaves. But in his mind, he was Commander Daniel, the fearless leader of a mission to the Red Planet. His backyard wasn't just grass and a swing set. It was the cratered, alien landscape of Mars. And his most trusted officer, the key to the entire operation, was the Comet Crusader. The Comet Crusader was a marvel of tin and paint, a foot-tall robot of gleaming silver with bright blue eyes. It was a birthday gift, and in the month since he'd received it, it had rarely left his side. It was more than a toy. It was a vessel for his boundless imagination. He would spend hours making it stomp across the yard, narrating its adventures in a low, serious voice. His 4-year-old sister, Clara, sat on the back steps, watching him. She was his loyal audience, a silent participant in his cosmic journeys. He'd often run over to her, his face flushed with the seriousness of his game, to deliver an urgent mission report. He did so on that afternoon. He picked up the Comet Crusader and marched over to the steps, placing the robot gently in front of her. He pointed to its chest. He explained that this wasn't just a robot. It was a starhopper. He told her that one day he would shrink down, climb inside, and fly it past the moon. He pointed a small finger to the sky, already pale with the coming dusk, and promised to wave to her from the rings of Saturn. Clara didn't understand the words, not really, but she understood the look in her brother's eyes. It was the look of a boy who believed in magic. That is the last clear memory she would ever have of him. A shared moment of impossible, wonderful belief hanging in the autumn air. Inside the house, their mother, Sarah Peterson, glanced at the clock on the kitchen wall. It was nearly 5:30. The smell of roasting chicken filled the small home. Her husband, John, would be home from the factory any minute. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the back porch, expecting to see her 2 children playing, but she only saw Clara, still. Sitting on the steps, now poking at a beetle with a twig, the yard was empty. "Clara, honey, where's your brother?" The little girl just shrugged, her attention fixed on the beetle. Sarah called his name. "Danny, dinner!" Her voice was cheerful, the sing-song call of a mother summoning her child home. Silence. Only the rustle of leaves in a sudden breeze. She tried again, a little louder this time, a flicker of annoyance in her tone. Daniel Peterson, I mean it. Get in here and wash your hands. The silence that answered was different. It felt heavier, deeper. The cheerful evening light suddenly seemed thin, and a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air crept up Sarah's spine. She walked down the steps and across the yard, her footsteps quickening. Danny? She checked behind the large oak tree. Nothing. She peered into the small tool shed her husband kept by the fence. Empty. She scanned the length of the fence line, looking for a small boy who might be hiding. The world, which had felt so safe and contained just moments before, now seemed to have too many edges, too many places for a little boy to slip through. A cold knot tightened in Sarah's stomach. His name was a raw tear in her throat now. Danny! By the time John's car pulled into the driveway, the sun was a dying orange smear on the horizon, and Sarah's calls had turned into choked sobs. He saw the look on her face, and his own smile vanished. He didn't even need to ask. In seconds, he was running, shouting Danny's name into the growing darkness. The hours that followed blurred into a nightmare of escalating panic. It started with the two of them. Then, neighbors, drawn by the commotion, began to emerge from their homes, their faces etched with concern. Flashlight beams cut sharp, frantic cones through the twilight, dancing across lawns and bushes. The search spilled out of the Petersons' yard and into the street, then into the woods that bordered their property line. For 4-year-old Clara, the world had turned upside down. She was brought inside by a neighbor, placed on the living room sofa, a world of adult fear swirling around her. She saw men in uniforms, strangers with serious faces, walking through her house. She saw her father's face, pale and hard as stone. She heard her mother's voice on the telephone, a thin, splintering sound she had never heard before. Later, a police officer knelt in front of her. He had kind eyes, but his questions made no sense. Had she seen Danny leave? Did he talk to anyone? Did he say where he was going? She just shook her head, clutching a doll to her chest, overwhelmed by the sheer, terrifying strangeness of it all. All she knew was that dinner was late, her mother was crying, and Danny, her brother, the commander of the Spaceways, was gone. As the night deepened, a cold, heavy rain began to fall, turning the frantic search into a desperate, muddy struggle. Each passing minute felt like an eternity. Hope, which had been so strong at sunset, began to fray with every unanswered call, with every sweep of a flashlight beam that revealed only wet leaves and empty space. By midnight, the entire town of Maple Creek knew that Danny Peterson had vanished. The porch light of his home shone on an empty yard, illuminating a small, forgotten battlefield of leaves, and on the back steps, left behind in the chaotic rush, sat the Comet Crusader, its blue eyes staring blankly into the cold, dark night. The first night bled into the first day, and the frantic chaos of the initial search solidified into a grim, organized procedure. State police reinforcements arrived, setting up a command post at the local fire station. Maps were unfurled on the hoods of cars, and hundreds of volunteers from Maple Creek and surrounding towns fanned out, forming long, methodical lines to comb through the dense Ohio woods. They searched for days, their hopes dwindling with every passing hour, with every patch of forest that yielded nothing but fallen leaves and silence. For John and Sarah Peterson, these days were a special kind of torture. They were forced to sit in their home, a place that now felt like a cage, while strangers decided the fate of their son. They answered the same questions over and over, recounting the last hours, the last words, the last mundane details of a life that had been shattered. Every knock on the door sent a jolt of equal parts hope and terror through them. The police, working with the little they had, constructed a narrative. Danny was an adventurous, energetic boy. The woods were vast and alluring. It was a tragic but simple story. He had wandered off, gotten disoriented as darkness fell, and succumbed to the cold autumn night. It was the most logical explanation, the one that required no villain, only the cruel indifference of nature. This became the official theory, a story told to the press, and a story the Petersons, in their exhaustion and despair, had no choice but to consider. Investigators did their due diligence. They spoke to every neighbor on the street. Their conversation with Arthur Finch was noted as being brief and unproductive. He met the officers at his door and didn't invite them in. He was irritable, complaining that the search parties were trampling his lawn. When asked about Danny, he grunted that the boy was a nuisance, always making a racket. He confirmed he was at his shift at the factory all afternoon, a fact his foreman would later verify. The police saw a grumpy, unhelpful old bachelor, nothing more. They checked the box next to his name and moved on. The shadow was there right next door, but no one had any reason to look at it. As weeks turned into months, the crushing weight of what came next settled upon the Peterson household. The silence. The search was called off. The news crews packed up their vans. The well-meaning neighbors, who had filled their kitchen with casseroles and condolences, returned to their own lives, to their own children. The world moved on, but inside the Peterson home, time stopped on October 23, 1965. John Peterson retreated into himself. The cheerful father who tossed a baseball in the yard was replaced by a hollow-eyed man who worked double shifts at the factory, returning home only to eat in silence and fall into a fitful sleep. Sarah tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for Clara, but it was a brittle facade. She kept Danny's room exactly as he had left it. His bed was made, his clothes were folded in the drawers, his model spaceships were perfectly aligned on his desk. For years, it remained an immaculate, heartbreaking museum to a boy who would never grow up. It was a room no one entered, but its presence was felt in every corner of the house. Clara grew up in this climate of unspoken grief. She learned, with the keen intuition of a child, that the surest way to see a shadow pass over her mother's face was to mention Danny's name. So she stopped. She became a quiet, observant girl, a ghost in her own home, tiptoeing around the vast, invisible crater her brother's absence had left behind. Her own memories of him began to feel unreliable, like scenes from a half-forgotten dream, less real than the palpable sorrow that defined her family. She watched the world from her window. She watched the seasons change the woods where her brother had supposedly been lost. And she watched her neighbor, Mr. Finch. He was a constant, unsettling fixture. A man who never had visitors, who spent his weekends meticulously tending to his garden with a grim expression. A few weeks after Danny's disappearance, Clara watched him nail a sheet of plywood over the small window of his tool shed. Her father, briefly glancing over, had just sighed and said, "That man would build a fortress around himself if he could." It was just another strange act from a strange man, a detail lost in the fog of a much larger tragedy. The years marched on, marked by the milestones Danny never reached. On what would have been his 10th birthday, Sarah baked his favorite chocolate cake, placed a single candle in the middle, and then broke down, unable to serve it. The year he should have graduated high school, John and Sarah sat in their car in the school parking lot, watching other families celebrate, unable to bring themselves to go home. Clara experienced her own life through a strange, dual lens. Her first day of school, her first dance, her graduation, each moment of happiness was tinged with a subtle guilt, a feeling that it was a celebration he was missing. She carried him with her, not as a memory, but as a question, a constant nagging what if that shaped her view of the world. It made her cautious, introspective, and fiercely protective of the parents her brother's disappearance had broken. Decades passed. The town of Maple Creek grew and changed. New families moved onto the street, unaware of the story that haunted the small house with the perfectly manicured lawn. The police file on Daniel Peterson gathered dust in an archive, reclassified from missing to presumed deceased. The case, for all official purposes, was cold, stone cold. John and Sarah Peterson grew old, their grief softening into a permanent, weary melancholy. They passed away within a year of each other, never knowing the truth, having lived out their lives next door to the answer they so desperately sought. Clara was left alone with the story. She was a wife now, mother to two children of her own, living in a different city. But she was still, in a quiet part of her soul, the 4-year-old girl on the back steps, waiting for her brother to come home. The long desert of uncertainty had been her entire life. She had accepted that she would carry that question with her to her own grave. She had no idea that the answer was not buried in the woods, but was waiting, sealed in soot and silence, just a few feet from where she used to play. 58 years. After Danny Peterson disappeared, the story had settled into a sad local legend, a cautionary tale for children who strayed too far from home. For Clara, it was simply the landscape of her life. But landscapes can change in an instant. All it takes is a single, unexpected discovery. The year was 2023. The Peterson house on Elm Street, which had stood as a silent monument to loss for so long, was finally being emptied. Clara, now 62, moved through the dusty rooms, sorting through the remnants of her parents' lives. It was a task of quiet sorrow, each object a memory, each empty room an echo of the past. Her children, Leo and Sophie, were there to help. They had grown up with the story of their lost uncle, a boy frozen in time, and they understood the weight of this final farewell to the house. Leo, a contractor by trade, had a practical eye. While Sophie helped her mother sort through old photographs, he was assessing the house itself, noting what needed to be fixed before it could be sold. He shined a flashlight up the chimney in the living room. It was a routine inspection, a simple act of due diligence. He expected to see nothing but darkness and brick, but his light caught on something lodged about 10 feet up, a blockage. He called to his mother and sister, telling them he needed to clear it out. He brought in a set of long-handled chimney brushes and tools from his truck. The sound of metal scraping against brick echoed through the quiet house. For several minutes, he struggled with the obstruction, whatever it was. Then, with a final jarring clatter, it came loose, falling down the flue and landing in the hearth with a hollow metallic thud. It was a black, shapeless lump, caked in a thick layer of soot and creosote. Leo nudged it with his boot, confused. Sophie peered at it, guessing it was a piece of an old stovepipe, or perhaps a bird's nest that had petrified over the years. But Clara stared at it, her heart beginning to beat in a strange, forgotten rhythm. There was something familiar about its shape. Leo picked it up with a gloved hand and tapped it against the brick, trying to knock the grime loose. A large flake of black soot fell away, revealing a patch of gleaming, unmistakable silver. Sophie gasped. Leo froze. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. He carried it to the kitchen sink and gently rinsed it under a stream of water. The black crust dissolved, and from the grime of 6 decades, a ghost emerged. A foot-tall tin robot, with round blue eyes and the words Comet Crusader emblazoned on its chest. It was impossible. The Comet Crusader had vanished with Danny. The police, the family, everyone had assumed it was lost with him in the woods, buried under 60 years of soil and leaves. To see it now, here, was like watching a dream materialize. Clara took the robot from her son's hands. It was cold and heavy. She ran a thumb over its head, a motion she hadn't made since she was 4 years old. Her children watched, her silent, witnessing a reunion they couldn't possibly understand. For a few long moments she was lost in the memory, the bittersweet pain of seeing this piece of her brother, this relic of a lost world. It was a sad, beautiful, and final piece of closure, or so she thought. Her fingers, moving on their own, found the small metal latch on the robot's back, the battery compartment. It was a familiar, reflexive gesture, an echo of watching Danny play. The latch was stiff, rusted shut by time and humidity. Leo offered to pry it open with a screwdriver, but Clara shook her head. This was something she had to do. She worked at it, her fingernail pressing into the metal, until, with a sharp click, the small door popped open. She expected to see an empty, corroded space. Instead, she saw a tiny, yellowed square of paper folded over and over upon itself, wedged inside. The atmosphere in the kitchen changed. The gentle nostalgia evaporated, replaced by a sudden, sharp tension. This was not a toy. It was a time capsule. Sophie moved closer. Leo held his breath. Clara's hands began to tremble. With painstaking care, she used her fingernails to coax the fragile paper out of its metal tomb. It was brittle, threatening to crumble into dust. She placed it on the kitchen table, and with a touch as light as a breath, began to unfold it. Each crease opened a door to the past, a past she thought she knew. When it was finally open, she saw the writing. It was not her mother's elegant script or her father's blocky print. It was the shaky, uneven pencil lettering of a child. 6 words that had waited in the darkness for 58 years. 6 words that took the story of a tragic accident and twisted it into something monstrous. The note said, "Mr. Finch hurt me in the shed." In that instant, the floor beneath Clara's feet seemed to vanish. The narrative of her entire life, of the wandering boy, the unforgiving woods, the blameless tragedy, was a lie. Her brother hadn't wandered off. He had been taken. His final moments hadn't been spent lost and alone, but in fear of a man she knew, a man she had seen 1,000 times from her window. The answer had never been in the woods. It had been right next door. The truth had been there all along, hiding behind a neighbor's wall, sealed in a tin robot, waiting in the dark. The silence in the kitchen was shattered by Sophie's gasp, a sound that finally broke the spell. Leo reached out and put a steadying hand on his mother's shoulder. Clara looked up from the note, her eyes wide with a truth too terrible to comprehend. There was no discussion, no debate. There was only one thing to do. She carefully folded the note, placed it in her handbag, and her son drove her to the Maple Creek police station. The building was new, a modern brick structure that had replaced the small stone-faced station she remembered from her childhood. Inside, the air was sterile, the lights fluorescent. When Clara, a woman in her 60s with a haunted look in her eyes, told the young officer at the front desk that she had a new clue in the 1965 disappearance of her brother, he looked at her with a mixture of pity and confusion. Cold cases were the stuff of television shows, not something that walked in off the street on a Tuesday afternoon. But the name Peterson still held a faint echo in the town's memory. A supervisor was called, and soon the original case file, a thick, brittle manila folder with Peterson, Daniel, typed on the tab, was pulled from the deep archives. The file and Clara's incredible story landed on the desk of the one person in the department equipped to handle it, Detective Isabella Rossi. Rossi was a detective in her late 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes that had seen the worst of human behavior. She specialized in cases the world had forgotten, believing that time did not extinguish the need for answers. She invited Clara into her office and listened without interruption for nearly an hour. She listened to the story of the quiet grief, the house full of memories, the son inspecting a chimney, and the 6 words on a scrap of paper. Rossi displayed no shock, no skepticism. She projected a professional calm that was, for Clara, the first solid ground she had stood on since the discovery. When Clara finished, her voice trembling, Rossi leaned forward. She explained that while the story was powerful, the note itself was, for now, just a piece of paper. To become evidence, it had to be authenticated. She looked directly at Clara and made a promise. She would see this through, wherever it led. For the first time, Clara felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel, hope. But it was a terrifying hope, because it could only be fulfilled by confirming the monster next door was real. The Comet Crusader and its precious cargo were sealed in evidence bags and sent to the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, the state's top crime lab. The first test was for the evidence itself. Forensic chemists analyzed the composition of the paper. They found trace elements and bleaching agents common in paper manufacturing in the mid-1960s, formulas that had been phased out decades ago. They analyzed the graphite from the pencil and found it consistent with the standards of the era. The note was not a modern forgery. It was a genuine artifact, a voice from the past. The next step was to authenticate the author. Detective Rossi became a historian digging through municipal archives and school district records that had been transferred to microfilm. After days of searching, she found what she was looking for: kindergarten and first-grade report cards for Danny Peterson. Attached to them were classroom assignments, simple worksheets with his name written in the clumsy print of a 6-year-old. These known samples were sent to the lab's top forensic document examiner. The examiner placed the note and the schoolwork side by side. Under a high-powered microscope, the narrator's voice would explain the science, how a child's handwriting, while inconsistent, has unique characteristics. The way they form the loop of a P, the baseline they rest their letters on, the pressure they apply with the pencil. The expert compared them all. The letter formations were a match. The spacing was a match. But he noted something else. The writing on the note was heavier, more erratic. The letters were shaky, the pressure uneven. These, he concluded, were not signs of a different writer. They were classic indicators of writing under extreme physical or emotional duress. Detective Rossi called Clara. She walked her through the findings calmly, fact by fact. The paper was from the time. The pencil was from the time. And the handwriting was Danny's. For most people, this would be a moment of pure victory. For Clara, it was a confirmation that plunged her deeper into a revised, more horrific past. The official story that had structured her family's grief for 58 years had been definitively proven false. Her brother hadn't been the victim of a tragic accident. He was the victim of a crime. This knowledge recontextualized her entire life. She replayed every memory of Arthur Finch, his grumpy face glaring over the fence, the sharp, angry way he'd shouted at them if they were too loud, the plywood he'd nailed over his shed window just weeks after Danny was gone. Each memory, once an insignificant tile in the mosaic of her childhood, now seemed to glow with a sinister red light. Guilt washed over her in waves, a child's irrational guilt. Why didn't we know? Why didn't we see? She grieved for her parents all over again, this time with a burning anger. They had lived and died in sorrow, never knowing that the answer was just a stone's throw away, living a quiet, uninterrupted life. The ghost of Danny was no longer a sad, formless phantom. He now had a story, a final chapter that had been hidden away. Detective Rossi's call had given Clara the truth she never knew she was looking for. And with that truth came a new, burning question that eclipsed all others. What was Rossi going to do about the man who had lived next door? The man named Finch? With the note authenticated, the cold case of Danny Peterson was suddenly white-hot. The investigation, which had been a historical review, was now an active hunt. Detective Isabella Rossi had her target, a name that had been hiding in the case file for 58 years, Arthur Finch. The challenge was immense. She had a note from a ghost, but she needed to build a case in the present. She needed to dismantle a lie that had stood for more than half a century. Finding Finch was surprisingly easy. A few keystrokes in a modern database revealed what decades of neighborhood life had obscured. Arthur Finch, age 88, was a resident at the Northwood Assisted Living Facility, a state-run nursing home, about 100 miles west of Maple Creek. He had sold his house years ago, leaving no forwarding address, and had quietly disappeared into the anonymous system of elder care. Detective Rossi drove to Northwood the next day. The facility smelled of antiseptic and boiled vegetables, a place where time moved slowly, measured out in medication schedules and televised game shows. She found Finch in a common room, sitting alone in a wheelchair, staring blankly at a television. He was physically frail, a pale, skeletal man, but his eyes, when they turned to her, were as sharp and hostile as ever. Rossi introduced herself and sat down. She didn't mention the note. She didn't mention the robot. She simply told him she was reviewing an old case, the disappearance of a boy named Danny Peterson from his neighborhood in 1965. Finch's face hardened. He repeated the same story he had told the police all those years ago, his voice a gravelly, irritated rasp. "I was at work," he said. "I told them that then. I'm telling you now. I didn't see a thing. The boy was a pest, always making noise." He spat the words out, a lie polished by 6 decades of repetition. He was daring her to challenge him. Rossi listened, her expression unreadable. She knew he was lying, but for now, she let the lie hang in the air between them. She thanked him for his time and left. On the drive back, Rossi called Clara. She updated her on the situation. Finch was alive, but was sticking to his original story. The wall he had built in 1965 was still standing. Frustrated, Rossi pressed Clara for any detail she could remember about him, specifically about the shed mentioned in the note. "Think back, Clara. Was there anything unusual about that shed?" The question acted like a key, unlocking a memory that had been sealed away for decades. Clara fell silent for a moment, and then her voice came back, trembling with a sudden, chilling realization. "The window," she said. "He boarded up the window. A few weeks after Danny was gone. I remember watching him do it. He was angry, hammering the nails so hard I could hear it from our kitchen. My dad just said he was a strange man who wanted his privacy." It was a detail she hadn't thought of in over 50 years. To Rossi, it was gold. It was an action connecting Finch to that specific location right after the crime. Now Rossi had a singular focus: the alibi. The factory job was the linchpin of Finch's entire defense. The company, a local tool and die manufacturer, had gone bankrupt in the late 1980s. Its physical assets were sold off, its buildings demolished. But corporations, even dead ones, leave behind a paper trail. Rossi began the painstaking process of tracking down the company's archives. Her search led her to a state repository, a vast, climate-controlled warehouse that served as a graveyard for defunct Ohio businesses. For 2 days, she worked in a small, dusty room, sifting through dozens of cardboard boxes filled with the factory's personnel records. It was a tedious, mind-numbing task, scrolling through roll after roll of microfilm, searching for a single name in a sea of thousands. Finally, in a box labeled Employee Records 1965, HL, she found him, Finch Arthur. And next to his name, she found the entry that would blow the case wide open. Under the column for termination date, the entry read October 22, 1965, the day before Danny Peterson disappeared. The reason for termination was, noted in a clipped formal abbreviation, gross misconduct. See disciplinary file. Rossi's heart hammered in her chest. She scrolled frantically through the microfilm until she found the corresponding disciplinary file. It detailed a violent confrontation on the factory floor. Arthur Finch had physically assaulted a co-worker, a man named Walter Hedges, after Hedges had accidentally disturbed Finch's meticulously organized workstation. The lie was not just broken, it was shattered. To strengthen the case, Rossi needed to understand the man behind the file. She ran Walter Hedges' name through the system, hoping he was still alive. She found him, an 86-year-old retiree, living in a small town on the Florida coast. She called him. At first, Walter was hesitant. He didn't want to dredge up a painful memory from a lifetime ago. But when Rossi told him why she was calling, he agreed to talk. He told her the story. He remembered Finch as a man with a quiet, simmering rage. Everyone at the factory knew to give him a wide berth. He was obsessed with his space, Walter said, his voice crackling over the phone line. Everything had to be just so. I knocked over a small jar of screws, a mistake. He looked at me, and it was like a switch flipped. He flew at me screaming, punched me right in the face. Walter had reported the incident, and Finch was fired on the spot. I always wondered what happened to him, Walter concluded. He was a walking powder keg. I'm just not surprised to hear it finally went off. Detective Rossi hung up the phone. The chase was over. The shadows had receded, revealing a clear and damning picture. She had the note, written in a dying boy's hand, placing him with Finch in the shed. She had the physical evidence of Finch boarding up that same shed's window right after the crime. She had the irrefutable proof that his alibi was a deliberate, calculated lie. And now she had a first-hand witness to his explosive, violent temper. She had everything she needed. It was time to go back to the Northwood Assisted Living Facility. It was time for her second and final conversation with Arthur Finch. When Detective Rossi returned to the Northwood Assisted Living Facility, the air of the place had not changed, but she had. The first time, she had been searching for a thread. This time, she carried the entire tapestry of the truth with her. She found Arthur Finch in the same chair, in the same common room, a frail man who had no idea that his 58-year-old lie was about to be called due. She pulled up a chair and sat directly in front of him, her gaze unwavering. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "Mr. Finch," she began, her voice calm and even, "we need to talk again about October 23rd, 1965. Finch scoffed, a dismissive, rattling sound in his chest. "I told you. I was at work. I don't know anything." "That's not true," Rossi said flatly. "I know you weren't at work, Arthur. I have your employment records from the factory. They show your employment was terminated on October 22nd, the day before Danny disappeared. You were fired for physically assaulting your co-worker, Walter Hedges." For the first time, a flicker of genuine fear appeared in Finch's eyes. His paper-thin skin seemed to tighten over his cheekbones. He gripped the arms of his wheelchair, his knuckles white. "That's a lie. He was the one who—" Rossi cut him off, her voice still level. "I spoke to Walter. He remembers it clearly, and I know that just a few weeks after Danny went missing, you boarded up the window of your tool shed. Why would you do that, Arthur?" Finch's face was a mask of fury. "It was my property. I can do what I want with my property." "You can," Rossi agreed. "But it's a strange coincidence, because that's where he said it happened. That's where he said you hurt him." Finch stared at her, his mouth opening and closing silently. "He said? Who said?" "No one saw anything." Rossi leaned in, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Danny saw Arthur, and Danny told us." She paused, letting the impossible statement hang in the air. "We found his toy robot, the Comet Crusader. It was in the chimney of his old house, and he left something for us inside, a note." The last vestiges of color drained from Finch's face. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. Rossi recited the words from memory, each one a hammer blow against his crumbling defenses. "Mr. Finch hurt me in the shed." And with that, the monster that had been hiding inside the bitter old man for nearly 60 years finally collapsed. A dry, ragged sob escaped his lips. The fight was gone. The decades of denial, the carefully constructed walls of his lie, all came crashing down, leaving only the pathetic, ugly truth. He began to talk, the words spilling out, a confession that had been rotting inside him for a lifetime. The narrator's voice recounts the confession. It wasn't a story of a calculating kidnapper. It was a story of pathetic, explosive rage. On that October afternoon, Finch was at home, seething. He had been fired the day before, a deep wound to his fragile pride. He was in his yard when he heard the crack of glass. He turned and saw the small star-shaped fracture on the window of his shed. The one place in the world that was his, that was perfect. And he saw little Danny Peterson standing there, frozen, a stone at his feet. All the rage Finch felt at his boss, at Walter Hedges, at the world, he focused on that 6-year-old boy. He stormed over, shouting, grabbing Danny by the arm to drag him inside and show him what he had done. He wasn't going to kill him. He was just going to scare him, to teach him a lesson about property. But Danny, terrified, struggled and pulled back. The boy lost his footing on the shed's concrete step. He fell backwards, his head hitting the hard edge of the foundation with a sickening thud. And then there was silence. Finch stared down at the small, still body. The rage vanished, replaced by a cold, absolute panic. He was no longer an angry man. He was a killer. He dragged Danny's body into the shed and hid it. Later that night, under the cover of darkness, he buried him in the dense woods deep behind his own property. Before he did, he noticed the toy robot lying in the grass near the shed. It was evidence, another thing out of place. He snatched it up, ran into his own house, and in a moment of frantic inspiration, he shoved it up his own chimney, hoping the winter's fires would melt it into an unrecognizable lump of metal. He never knew about the note. He never knew that in his haste to hide the evidence, he had actually preserved it. After the confession, the official procedures were a grim formality. The police arrested Arthur Finch, an 88-year-old in a wheelchair, for the murder of a 6-year-old boy. Paramedics were present, monitoring his health as he was read his rights, a frail and pathetic epilogue to a lifetime of hidden violence. Detective Rossi stepped outside into the fresh air and made the final, most difficult call of the case. She called Clara. She didn't recount the brutal, pathetic details. She simply said the words that Clara had, on some subconscious level, been waiting her entire life to hear. He confessed, "Clara, it's over. We know what happened." Clara was silent on the other end of the line. There was no cry of victory, no shout of relief. There was only the sound of a quiet, shaky breath. The truth, now that it was here, was not a liberating force. It was a lead weight. Her brother, the bright, space-loving boy, had not been taken by a faceless monster in a grand, evil scheme. He had died because of a broken window. His entire life, traded for a moment of pathetic, uncontrollable rage. The smallness of it, the sheer stupid wastefulness of it all, was the most heartbreaking part of the entire story. The mystery was solved, but the tragedy felt deeper than ever. Justice, when it arrives 60 years late, does not come like a clap of thunder. It comes like a quiet, somber rain. Arthur Finch was formally charged with the murder of Danny Peterson. But there would be no trial, no dramatic courtroom testimony. The confession had taken the last of his strength, the last of his will. His health, already frail, declined rapidly. 2 months after his arrest, he died in the secure ward of the prison hospital, taking the full dark texture of his secret with him to the grave. His death was a quiet, unceremonious end to a life defined by a single, hidden act of violence. For Clara, the world outside her door briefly erupted. The story was a media sensation. "Cold case killer caught by toy robot," the headline screamed. But she retreated from the noise. The world saw a fascinating puzzle that had been solved. Clara was left to live with the raw, painful answer. There was no victory parade, no feeling of triumph. The relief of knowing the truth was real, but it was a heavy, suffocating thing. It meant she had to grieve her brother all over again, not as the lost boy from a tragic story, but as the victim of a pointless, brutal crime. The pain was sharper now, more defined. She grieved for her parents, for the decades they had spent wondering, searching, praying, all while living just a few yards from the man who held the answer. One afternoon she visited their graves, and in the quiet of the cemetery she sat and told them everything. A final, one-sided conversation that brought a strange and sorrowful peace. Based on the detailed confession Finch had given to Detective Rossi, investigators returned to the woods behind what was once the Finch property. After a 2-day search of the overgrown land, they found him. Danny Peterson's remains were finally recovered, bringing a definitive end to the search that had begun on an autumn evening so long ago. He was finally given a proper burial. Nearly 60 years after he had disappeared, a small group gathered under a gray sky to lay Danny Peterson to rest next to his parents. Clara was there, with her children and grandchildren. A few old residents of Maple Creek came to pay their respects, their faces a mixture of sadness and awe at the final chapter of a story that had haunted their town for a lifetime. They were finally bringing him home. In the months that followed, Clara found her own way to build a legacy from the wreckage of the past. She understood that a story cannot end with a gravestone. It must be transformed. She established the Danny's Comet Foundation, a small local charity dedicated to a single purpose: to provide funding and volunteer resources for cold cases involving missing children. It was a way to ensure that other families, lost in their own long deserts of uncertainty, might one day find the answers that her family so belatedly received. Her life was different now. The constant nagging question that had been the quiet background music to Her existence was gone. In its place was a certainty, both terrible and clarifying. The story of her brother no longer ended in mystery, but in a tragic human truth. Some time later, on a clear summer night, she sat in her own backyard with her grandchildren, wrapped in blankets, looking up at the sky. She pointed out the constellations, her voice soft in the darkness, telling them the story of a brave little boy who loved the stars, a boy who had once promised to wave from the rings of Saturn. The pain had not vanished, but it was no longer the whole story. Now there was also legacy. The story of Danny Peterson reminds us that truth, no matter how long it's buried, deserves to be heard. Let us know in the comments if you've ever heard of a case like this in your own hometown.